What was it like writing with an author like James Patterson as a co-collaborator, as opposed to the previous co-collaborations you did?
Honestly, it was very unique because he's written with so many different people. He's learned to be very adaptive. He can pivot and basically come up with something that's going to work well with his co-author. And I've done the same thing my entire writing career. So you put two of us together who are basically very flexible. We had no problems working with each other, other than one. When we first sat down, we had a lunch down in Palm Beach. We started hashing out ideas for the first book, and I at the time I was a pantser. And I'm sure your audience knows that term. He is comes from the exact opposite. He is a notorious outliner. He does 30 to 50 pages of an outline before he starts writing a book. So we've got these two different styles, and I didn't think we'd be able to work together. He called me up a couple months later and he said, "You know what? Let's try it your way. Let's try to pants a novel." So I'm the only guy who's ever gotten James Patterson to pants a novel. I thought I was going to convince Patterson to become a pantser, and he convinced me to become an outliner. So we're always learning.
Hey JD, welcome to the Stark Reflections podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I can't believe I haven't had you on this podcast in all these years, even though I've listened to you and, of course, bumped into you several times over the years, thanks to some mutual friends of ours.
You are clearly a slacker.
I know, I can't believe it, but I made up for it, decided, and I'm so glad we had that conversation at Author Nation. What is that, 3 weeks ago now?
Yeah, it's hard to believe it's already been 3 weeks. Like this whole year is just it's flying by.
Wow. So I want to get into Hampton Press, and I want to get into this new realm of hybrid publishing and how it operates. But let's go back to your genesis, your beginning, when you
Sure.
actually finally got into the writing realm, and how what led you there?
Well, I'd been writing pretty much my entire life. I grew up without a TV in the house, so my mom was taking us to the library from like the earliest age that I can remember. So I was reading by the time I got into kindergarten, and I always loved books. And my sister, I've got a sister who's 15 months younger than me, so I used to scribble out stories and I would staple them, and I created like a library in my room, and she'd check them out, and I would charge her late fees. And like that's kind of where this whole thing
Little
started. And
businessman
my
right away.
Yeah, you got to make money on this. You got to hustle. My mom, she basically told me from the get go, writing is a fantastic hobby, but you can't make a living at it. You have to get a real job. And like she drilled that thought into my head. So you always believe your parents. So I finished up high school. I went off to college, and I actually got a couple of degrees. I got one in finance, another one in business, another in IT. I got halfway through a psychology degree, and I ended up working in finance. My last day job, I was a chief compliance officer at a brokerage firm, which is as horrible as it sounds, but it pays really well. So like I was balancing that.
Did it
But I would come
inspire
home and
some of the horror you wrote?
I think it probably did. So I was writing at night, so I had this job I hated during the daytime, and I would come home and I would write at night. During my college years, I worked for a lot of newspapers and magazines, and I basically stumbled into a side hustle as a book doctor and a ghostwriter. And I was just getting hired to, tweak manuscripts, help them get ready for publication, work with agents, work with editors to fine tune stuff. I did a lot of memoirs for other people. So I was doing that basically at night when I did the compliance gig during the daytime. Did that for a little over 2 decades, and over that time, I had 6 different books that hit the New York Times list that all came out with other people's names on the cover that I had essentially written, which gets old after a while. So when the number 6 hit up, this was around 2012, 2013, my wife pulled me aside. She said, "Listen, I know you want to become a full-time author. Let's figure out how to make this happen." But at that point, we were stuck because I had a good job that paid really well, and we had the trappings of that. We had a big house, we had cars, we had a boat. So our monthly nut was around $10,000 to $12,000. So we couldn't just pick up and leave. We were stuck with that job. So she came up with this crazy plan. We sold everything that we owned. We bought a tiny little duplex in Pittsburgh. We rented out one side to some tenants, and we moved into the other side. Basically got to the point where I could quit the job, live off of savings long enough to write that book, the first one. And I remember her sitting me down at the kitchen table and showing me the bank statement. She said, "It looks like you got about 18 months to make this writer thing go." Then that was it. Like putting my feet to the coals, I think is what I really needed.
Well, I mean, yeah, the decades of working on other people's projects behind the scenes, not having. So, how did it feel when you find that was Forsaken was the first novel, correct?
Yeah, and honestly, it was very weird because I had spent all those years basically writing and working with other people. It was always this collaborative process. I either had editors or newspapers that I was working for, or I was writing with other authors. All of a sudden, I'm behind a desk all by myself, writing a book that's original to me, and like I wasn't quite sure how to do that. Like I knew how to craft a good story. I knew what the folks in New York were looking for, but having nobody else, no other voice in the room, felt odd.
Oh yeah, that's it's so fascinating that you started off with those collaborations, with the ghostwriting, with doing the behind the scenes, then putting your name out there so everyone could see, oh, this is me. Right.
Yeah, but the truth is, and a lot of people have asked me like, what would have happened if you started publishing back in your 20s when I'd started doing all this other stuff? And the truth is, I don't think the books would hit as hard as they are today because I needed that 20 years of a learning curve. Writing memoirs was huge for me because I had to, like I did one for a female politician, so I had to churn out a book that was written in first person from her point of view. And when you do that kind of thing enough, it really helps you with character development. And like just these different voices that I had to produce.
Oh, I can only imagine. Yeah, you had to, as fiction writers do, get in the minds of the characters, which is
Yeah.
probably great for writing a great villain too, to really understand them from the inside.
Yeah, and I've got we haven't really talked about this, but I'm autistic. I'm got a form of autism called Asperger's syndrome, and one of the things that I learned early on is anybody that's autistic, we tend to mimic other people in social situations and things like that. I learned that I could do it on paper. So if somebody puts text in front of me written by somebody else, I can pick up on the vocabulary, the cadence, the writing style of that original author, and I can continue it in their voice, which is one of the reasons why I got a lot of writing gigs as a ghostwriter, back in the day because I could finish other projects and keep the voice consistent.
Oh my God, that is such an incredible talent to be able to do it. It's kind of like if a major author dies, and this has happened. I think when Richard Lehman passed away, I know Dean Koontz was a friend of his. Dean Koontz finished his last novel, but Dean's voice is significantly different than Richard Lehman's
Right.
was.
Yeah, I'm one of those guys that tends to get those kind of phone calls. Like when Sue Grafton died, I must have gotten 5 or 6 phone calls from people asking, "Are you going to do it? Are you going to write that Z book?" But I knew people in her family. I knew Sue's, like final wish was nobody's going to write that final book.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I knew it wasn't going to happen. But I did get a lot of those types of phone calls for estates. Just different projects that involved me basically being somebody else. I had one a few years back, now more like 15 years ago, I guess. But it was a New York Times bestseller. He was halfway through his novel and he didn't meet his deadline and had to get out on book tour. So they handed me the first half of the book that he wrote, gave me the outline for the second half, and I wrote the second half of the book. And it's seamless. Like when you read it, like I can't even really tell, which parts I wrote versus what he wrote, which is the end goal.
That's amazing. Now, I imagine there's people who are curious, like, oh my God, who? And I'm not going to ask who because I'm pretty sure the contracts have very much NDA kind of details in them. He's like, yeah, I'm going to do this work. I'm going to get paid well, but I'm not going to say who it
Yeah,
was.
there are always NDAs in those types of situations, and the truth is, ghostwriting is extremely lucrative. So you honor those NDAs because
Oh yeah,
you don't want to aggravate those people.
yeah. You don't want to be known as the guy who revealed.
Yeah, I mean, like in today's world, I write a lot of books with James Patterson, and we talk about this kind of thing all the time. He's probably the closest person I have in this industry that I talk to about it, and like even he doesn't know. Like I will not tell anybody. My wife is the only person on the planet that knows.
Well, of course, because I mean, there's
Yeah.
that spousal contractual.
Yeah, I gotta tell her, otherwise she gets curious why I'm locking myself in my office all the time.
Who are you writing today? Okay, so let's
Yeah.
talk about that. So, and again, I got to see the camaraderie you had with James Patterson at Author Nation as you interviewed him there. You could tell you guys knew each other very well. What was it like writing with an author like James Patterson as a co-collaborator, as opposed to the previous co-collaborations you did?
Honestly, it was very unique because he's written with so many different people. He's learned to be very adaptive. He can pivot and basically come up with something that's going to work well with his co-author. And I've done the same thing my entire writing career. So you put two of us together who are basically very flexible. We had no problems working with each other, other than one. When we first sat down, we had a lunch down in Palm Beach. We started hashing out ideas for the first book. And at the time I was a pantser. And I'm sure your audience knows that term. But I'd grown up, reading On Writing by Stephen King. He says that's the way you do it. I figured that's the way you do it. So I always came up with my characters, my plot, mixed them together, and let the story kind of tell itself. He is comes from the exact opposite. He is a notorious outliner. He does 30 to 50 pages of an outline before he starts writing a book. So we've got these two different styles, and I didn't think we'd be able to work together. So I left that lunch thinking, well, I just had lunch with James Patterson. That's a win, and figured it wasn't going to go anywhere. He called me up a couple months later, and he said, you know what? Let's try it your way. Let's try to pants a novel. So I'm the only guy who's ever gotten James Patterson to pants a novel, and I would write a crazy, like a scene, and paint him into some kind of ridiculous corner, thinking he's never going to get out of this. Hand it off to him, and like 15 minutes later, he'd send me a new chapter. Not only did he get out of it, but he put me into something even worse. And then we went back and forth writing the whole book that way, trying to basically one up each other. And it's the twistiest novel I've ever written. It's called The Coast to Coast Murders. But when we finished it, there was a lot of words on the cutting room floor. We wrote about 160,000 words of that book. We probably took 40 or 50 out before we got to the finished product because we had so much cleanup to do. So he sent me an outline for another one called The Noise. He said, we tried it your way. I want you to try it my way. So I wrote that book with him based on the outline, and it was so fast, so seamless. Very little work to do at the end. I thought I was going to convince Patterson to become a pantser, and he convinced me to become an outliner. So we're always learning.
Wow. So do you actually now outline? Because I remember previously you had said it's like it's in my head. I don't need it anywhere else when you're writing a book. Has that's changed then since you've co-authored with
It
Patterson?
depends on the project. So I'm doing a lot of co-authored stuff on my own. So I'm finding, and just like with Patterson, it's easier to have that outline, on paper before we start. I'm working on about 12 different books right now at the same time. Two of them are solo titles. One of them I completely outlined, and the other one I'm writing as a pantser. So I think it's just like anything else in this world. You talk to other writers, you hear what they're doing. If they're doing something different, I tend to try it just to see how it works in my world. Sometimes I incorporate something somebody else is doing. Sometimes I try it and it doesn't work, and it goes to the wayside. But I'm always evolving, trying to change it up.
Oh wow, it's so interesting. I think the only time I've ever outlined is with a co-author, and that's usually because you need to know where the other person's going, even if you round robin chapter by chapter, as you did with Patterson the initial time. My co-authors needed that outline, and I went, oh, I see how this works.
Well, what I honestly found, like I live on a little island in New England, and my writing day ends at 3 o'clock, and I go for a run around the island. It's 4.2 miles. And when I was pantsing novels, I would use that time to figure out, what comes next in the story. Because I basically just finished up, like what comes next, what comes next, what comes next. Now that I've got an outline in front of me, I can use that same time to figure out how do I make what comes next better. I can tweak it, I can make all these changes, and it's so easy to make a change. If I come up with something, for 100 pages down the road in the outline, I can adjust that whole outline in 5, 10, 15 minutes or something, and it's done. It's just a much simpler way to do it. You can, the novels have become much more detail oriented, much tighter. So I'm a big fan now.
Oh wow, and so I think I read somewhere that you or heard you in an interview talk about you start your day writing. You mentioned at like 3 o'clock you go for a run. What does
Yeah.
the workday? And I think you do business in the afternoon or afterwards. What does a typical workday look like for JD Barker? I mean, with all these projects, especially.
Yeah, so I've been doing this full time now for a little over 11 years. I told myself when I left the corporate world I would never set another alarm before 7 o'clock in the morning. So I get up at the crack of 7. I go downstairs, I get my coffee, say hi to my wife and daughter, and go right into my office. I turn off the internet when I first get in there. I don't look at anything online, including email. And I start the day by reviewing whatever I wrote the previous day. I usually edit as I'm reviewing it. By the time I get to the end of that, I just kind of hit the ground running on whatever comes next. I do about 2,000 to 3,000 words a day on whatever my main project is. And I get done with that about 10:30 or 11. Then I flip the switch on the internet and let the business side of things kind of flood the inbox, and deal with the agents, the editors, the publishers. And I'm in 150 different countries at this point, so I get a lot of stuff that
Yeah.
comes in, like books releasing at different times and things like that. So I deal with that. Then we schedule interviews, talks like this, for the afternoon, and everything wraps up at 3. I had to do that because early on, because I am in so many different countries, I would get interview requests at 11 o'clock at night, 3 o'clock in the morning, whatever worked with their time. And, I took all of them because I thought that's what you're supposed to do. But I got a year and a half into that, and I felt like I was going to just burn out. Like I had to change something. So now I force everybody to knock it out before 3 o'clock. If that can't happen, then it just doesn't happen.
Oh, I love that. Wow, I love that. And so just a little behind the scenes is we had a chat at in Vegas about doing an interview. You followed up on that as well, and then I coordinated it with a virtual assistant, or as you actually have a team or some
Yeah,
people that are working for you to do this?
she's virtual. I think she's in the Philippines. I've got a lot of people that I work with on the PR side. I think about 4 or 5 different PR agencies at any given time.
Right.
When I first started doing this, you had mentioned Kuntz. I know Dean Kuntz really well. When my first book was coming out, I hired the same publicist that he used in New York. It was something. It was ridiculous. It was like $20,000 a month for the retainer. In that first month, they got me. I think it was 3 blog reviews and like 1 newspaper article for $20,000. Like, this is not sustainable. I need to come up with a better way. So what I do in today's world is I pay everybody on an a la carte basis. So like the girl that you talk to, she gets paid for setting up this particular interview. She can set up as many as she wants, and she gets paid for each one that she sets up, or she could do absolutely nothing and get paid for nothing. So yeah, everybody gets paid on a, just based on the amount of work they do for me, which has worked out fantastic, since I started doing that. I've been doing that about 7 or 8 years now.
Yeah, actually, I hired a publicist a few years ago. I met him at a conference in Calgary, and Mickey basically sends an invoice at the end of the month, depending upon the things that have been booked. And I think that works way better than a lawyer-like retainer.
Yeah, but that's what most of them want. So you have to be very careful with that, because if you start breaking down the dollars, you take that 20 grand and you divide it up between the things that they get you. Like, is it really worth $4,000 for a podcast interview, or even like a review in like the New York Times? Like, I think one of the ones that they had gotten me was a major newspaper. But what I noticed is that the notification for that came into my inbox. I clicked on it and then I hit a paywall. So like, even though it was a great publication, I couldn't actually read it unless I subscribed to this newspaper.
Right.
So over the years, I've learned that bloggers, influencers, those kind of people can move the needle far better than traditional press or media can. Because if you give an interview to a blogger, they will write it up for their blog. They put stuff out on Facebook. They hit all the social medias with ads, with videos, all these different things. All of it promoting you and whatever the book is about, which is fantastic. But you get into the New York Times, they do none of that, other than try to charge the people that try to read it. So the world is just changing. You have to, take a step back and, I look at what I respond to just as an individual, not as an author or just a book buyer or whatever, but like, do I respond to emails? No, not really. Do I respond to television spots? Sometimes. But I look at everything that way, and I kind of structure what I do from a marketing standpoint based on what I feel the average Joe is actually responding to.
So we've kind of hinted at it because we talked about the way you've approached publicity, the way you approach things, the way you approached publishing. I mean, there were two paths. There was get an agent, get a publisher, and go through the traditional methods, which involves a lot of rejection, a lot of waiting, whatever. Then there's the take the reins in your own hands, doing the self-publishing. You did something that kind of merged the two of them together. You created your own path.
Yeah, well, I've been there. I've done all of them basically. With that first book, Forsaken, I knew everything about the publishing industry. I knew how to write a good book. I had no clue how to query an agent. So when that book was done, I literally bought a list of agents with their contact info and sent all of them a form letter. To whom it may concern. Here's my book. Here's what it's about. I didn't look at any of their websites to figure out what their specs were. None of that stuff. So for obvious reasons, I got very few replies. But I knew I had a good book, so I decided to indie publish it. And I ended up selling a lot of copies as an indie author. I moved about 250,000 copies of that first book. So when that happens, you end up on the radar of the traditional guys. They all watch those numbers. So when I queried for the second book, I had no problem at all. I queried 53 agents. I actually did it the right way. I looked to see what they wanted. I gave them their PDF document, Word document, Times New Roman, Arial font, whatever they said on their website, I gave them. But I queried 53. I got 14 offers when about in the first 2 weeks. Ended up going with the agent that I had at the beginning there. It's a very different world. But I'd gotten a taste of being an indie, and I think that's what really did me in, because I saw the economics of that. I saw the freedom that I had as an indie author. So even though my next couple books sold really well, I lost all of that freedom, and like I knew what I could have if I kept it for myself. So I got about 4 or 5 books in, and I called my agent. It was a book called A Caller's Game, and I told her, listen, I'm going to go ahead and publish this in English in all the English territories. You can go ahead and sell to my foreign publishers like you usually do, but I want to see if we can make that particular model work. So we did that for a couple of books, and I loved it because I got the economic benefits. I mean, you get like 70 cents on the dollar as an indie versus like 15 to 20 cents if you're lucky as a traditional. So I got that. I got to design my own covers. I loved all of that. But there's still a couple places I couldn't get into very easily as an indie author. You can't get into the big box stores like Costco and Target and Walmart, grocery stores, airports. Even when you sell a lot, like I can get an indie title into an airport bookstore if it sells a ton of copies, but for the most part, they try to ignore us. So I started thinking about like, how do I solve that particular problem? You fast forward a couple of years, I had a book coming out called Behind a Closed Door. My agent was shopping it. We got film options immediately, which lit a fire under the traditional publishers, and it was about to go to auction. And I got a phone call from a friend of mine at Random House, and she said, "Listen, we're about to offer on your book, and when it comes in, you need to turn it down." And I asked her why, and she said, "Well, we're about to lay off a number of people, and the editor who wants to buy your book is on that list, and like you can't tell anybody." I'm like, "Oh, wonderful." Got a similar phone call from somebody over at HarperCollins, so I called my agent and said, "We need to take a step back. We need to figure this out." A couple weeks later, all those industry layoffs happened. All these people that had been there forever basically got let go. So I reached back to people that I knew from the finance days. I knew that Simon & Schuster had recently gotten bought by a private equity firm. So I reached out to people that I knew on that part of the world, ultimately set up some meetings with Simon & Schuster, and we would, after some back and forth, they allowed me to create my own imprint on Simon & Schuster. So I basically have my own publishing house there, but they handle my print sales and distribution, which kind of gives me the best of all the worlds because I can publish what I want whenever I want. But it gets to those places that I couldn't get to before. And I honestly think that's where a lot of this is going. And we talked about that at Author Nation. I think a lot of big indie authors, if Random House comes up to them and says, "We'll give you $1 million for your next book," most of them are going to say no because they know that they can make that money on their own. They can make it easier and they can retain control. But if that same publisher comes to them and says, "Let's do this as a partnership. You can use our system, our warehouses, our distribution. We'll get your book at all these different places. Plus the print costs are substantially lower. Like all those things are very enticing. So it makes sense from a lot of different levels. And I think, not only from the indie author side, but from the big publisher side, because now they're not taking the risk anymore. Like I take the financial burden for every print run that I do. So if a book fails, it's on me. It's not on them. So that model works well for them too. So I think, sooner or later, they're going to have to pivot. These big guys have not changed anything, like in the last 40 years as far as what they're doing, and something's got to give. And I think this is going to be it.
I'm just so impressed and amazed with how you've made this work, how you've leveraged your knowledge of both sides in a way that's very rare, right? I think there's very few people who understand the trad side and the indie side to the depths that you do. I think potentially you and Jane Friedman may be two of the only people I know who kind of understand it and kind of get it, like the depths on both sides, right? Because usually people in trad have no clue what's going on, and then people in the indie community have no clue what's going on the other side, right?
A lot of it just comes from the experience. I had mentioned, my writing has improved over those 20 some years that I worked in finance, but I also had a firsthand knowledge of the business world. We were taking tiny little startups and cultivating them and bringing them to bringing out an IPO and bringing them public. So I saw these, very smart people grow businesses from nothing to very decent sized businesses. And I saw what worked and what didn't work. So I'm constantly absorbing knowledge. And, to me, selling books, I'm selling a widget. I'm selling a product that somebody else is going to have to buy and sell. You have to market it in a particular way. If I were to go broke tomorrow and you handed me a banana and said you need to make a living selling these bananas, I'm pretty sure I could figure out how to do it.
That sounds like a very appealing process. So, and now, okay, so let's talk about Hampton Creek Press and how that imprint works, how it operates, and how it leverages. So, you said, is Hampton Creek Press open to submissions, or is this something where if this is an indie author who potentially already has you said, sold 500,000 copies, that sort of thing? What's the logistics of this operation?
Yeah, so at this point, the only thing I'm publishing are my own books, and that's mainly because of an accounting issue. Simon & Schuster, they don't have the systems in place for me to deal with like royalties and royalty splits and all that type of stuff.
Okay.
So for me to do that, because I'm the publishing house, they're simply distribution, print, and sales.
Right.
So I would have to either hire somebody to do that, I would have to create some kind of system in-house, and I haven't brought myself to do that yet. Working with Patterson, he got me into the co-authoring thing, and I've really gotten that bug. So I've been hiring co-authors of my own, which I mentioned I've got 12 different books in the pipeline right now. Those are all work for hire situations. So at the end of the day, I own 100% of the book. So those other problems don't play a part in it.
Oh, wow.
So at the moment, I'm doing strictly solo titles and co-authored stuff. But eventually, I would like to expand into bringing in other authors.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. I guess I assumed with the other authors that it was some sort of somebody said, "Hey, I'd really like to work with you," like in that Patterson realm.
Yeah.
But this is you went out and found people and said, "Hey, let's do this book. Here's what I'm going to offer you," like that sort of deal.
Yeah, Yeah, because working as a ghostwriter and a book doctor, I've seen every problem that exists in the writing world over and over and over again. So when somebody puts a new author in front of me and I read their stuff, I can usually tell, like, they're at this particular level. If I spot a problem that I know can be fixed, then I can get them to this particular level. A lot of those authors tend to come out of the indie world. So when you're on the traditional side, you've got a lot of people telling you what you're doing wrong, and they help you fix it. Your agent is doing that, your editor is doing that, book after book after book. So that causes you to basically weed out some of these problems over time. But indie authors don't have that. They basically have reviews to fall back on. So what I typically find is, a lot of authors will have 5, 10, 15, 20 books that they've put out. All of them have the same problem that's kind of holding them at this level. And a lot of times it's a very fixable problem. So I seek out people that are like that, and I basically offer them an opportunity. Let's co-author a book. I'm going to walk you through every single aspect of it, from coming up with the title and the idea to writing that final word for the last page. I'm going to make you do the bulk of the work, but I'm going to hold your hand through the whole thing. I'm going to help you outline it. I'm going to teach you how to outline. I'm going to teach you how to write a compelling chapter. I'm going to show you what you're doing wrong. I'm going to teach you how to do it right. So we get to the entire end of that, and they basically get a master class in writing, primarily thrillers. That's what I focus on. But then once it comes out, I'm able to release it through Simon and Schuster. So now all of a sudden, this co-author's got a book that it's in all the places. I'm in 150 different countries. So now they've got a book that's in 150 different countries. So they get that learning curve. They get all of this exposure. So then when they come out with their next book, that problem that they had before is no longer there. If they decide they want to go the traditional route, that agent's going to query them. They're going to see the sales and track record. They know what, this person's already established in all these different places, which makes it a much easier sale. So it's a win-win for everybody. I mean, at the end of the day, I get a book out of it. More importantly, I get it recharges my batteries to be able to take somebody and get them to the next level. Like when I'm able to do that, a lot of people have helped me, throughout my career. Like this is my way of being able to pay it forward. So when I see that person succeed, with their next book, like to me, that's priceless. That's why it's all worthwhile.
I love the mentorship and the process that collaboration, because you can help them, you can show them, you can guide them through it. But it's not just a class; it's a very practical application. Because yeah, as you said, at the end of the day, here's a book. It's available not just online. It's going to be available. So Hampton Press, as an imprint of Simon and Schuster, which I can only imagine the investment that it took to make that happen. How did the sales? I used to be a bookseller, so the sales reps are actually, it's a catalog of titles that the sales reps are incorporating in when they go out and talk to booksellers.
Yeah, so my titles are in the same catalog as a regular Simon and Schuster title. They're not labeled any different. They're part of that book. I can sponsor it. I can get bigger page layout or whatever I want to do. But it basically looks no different than a Simon and Schuster title when they walk into that bookstore to tell the owner about it.
Oh, that is absolutely amazing, and I do love the pay it forward way that you're mentoring other writers and helping show them some of the
Yeah,
realities of publishing.
well, I mean, you run into it, like when we go to a conference like Author Nation, that's like the one place where people can actually talk about a lot of these things. And like, I know I worked a lot of my issues out by going to conferences and talking to other authors. You run into this particular problem, you're all by yourself at your desk at home. You can Google, you can try and search, you can do this, you can do that. But you walk into Author Nation, you raise your hand and mention that question. 40 people are going to raise their hand with the answer because they've all been there, done that. And for me, it's the same thing with books. Every time I find an author, like everybody's got that one little thing that can be improved on, that can be tweaked. And once you show it to them, it's like a light bulb going off. And it's so rewarding.
Oh, that is fantastic. So I want to go back to Author Nation. We were just talking about that, and something that you've done the last several years that I've seen you at Author Nation is a lot of authors are there. They are selling their books. Great, because you're our Reader Nation, that final day of Reader Nation, where they bring in readers and authors have an opportunity to sell their books and sign their books.
Mhm.
You had this giant skids worth of titles, gorgeous, gorgeous hardcovers that you've published. I actually have one from. Speaking of that first, was that the first
There you
Hampton
go.
Press, the behind closed doors, right? Nice, beautiful, gorgeous signed copy, Simon and Schuster book, giving them away. I mean, this could command a pretty penny, even if you sold it for a discount. Why?
Well,
Why, JD? Why were you giving these books away?
Here's the thing. One of the things that we were told as indie authors is you write a series, then you take the first title from the series and you give it away for free, and you rope the people in with that one. I'm literally doing the exact same thing with press. I liken myself to almost like being a drug dealer. I give everybody a free taste. I know I will hook them. The second they read that book, they're going to go out there and they're going to seek out the rest of my backlist. And it's always worked well for me. So like my print cost for that book is next to nothing. It more than makes up for it, because I know I will get the sales out of that. So to me, it's worthwhile to do that. I think every author should consider it because, people come to an event like Reader Nation, like, they're walking these tables, like, I feel icky trying to sell to them. And I think they kind of take a step back from the tables where they're being sold to, because nobody likes to be told, buy this book, buy this book, buy this book. So they approach every table, with this hesitancy. But if, when you're giving away books, it's the exact opposite. They come to the table, they want to talk to you, they tell their friends about it. It's the exact opposite experience. So to me, it's just another investment, no different than buying a television commercial to promote a title.
And to go back to something you said earlier that you made me think of is, $20,000 a month for a publicist. Well, I could spend a lot less and give away a lot of beautiful books to a lot of readers who are probably going to come back for more.
Yeah, I gave away a couple thousand books at the Author Nation, and like all of them are, are a good chunk of them will go out and they'll buy one of my other titles.
Yeah.
So it's always worthwhile to me.
Oh, that is fantastic. All right. So, as we get close to wrapping up this conversation, I'm just curious about advice that you would offer to authors. Not to say like what you would do different today, but just advice based on. And I'm going to come back to something you say, when you work with an author, when you read the book, you can see this thing. You just need to change this here and here and that aha moment. So in terms of the way authors approach the business of writing and publishing, what are some things where you go, oh, I just wish authors would know this or this other thing that could probably help them with their own aha in that realm.
Well, I think a lot of authors are chasing each other. They finish up their book, and I think first off, you have to write a 5-star book. I think that's got to be a given if you want it to sell at any decent numbers. So you've got to make sure either you tweak it and perfect it, edit it to the point where it's a 5-star title before anybody sees it. But once you've got that book finished and you're holding it up, you're ready to sell it. A lot of authors look at other authors, like what is working for so and so, what is working for these people, what is everybody else doing, and then they do those same things, which works to a certain extent. You can move a decent number of books doing that, but there's roughly 1 million titles published every year. Your book is one of them. I look for ways to stand out. So whenever I've got a title coming out, I look at what everybody else is doing. I'll make a list of it, and then I make a list of things that nobody is doing. And that's what I tend to do to sell my books. I'll give you an example. My latest book, it's called Something I Keep Upstairs. It's behind me here. It's a haunted house story that takes place here in New England. The house in the story is real. It actually exists on a little island off the coast of the island where I live. So when I was brainstorming for this book, trying to come up with marketing ideas, I decided I'm going to give away an overnight stay in the real haunted house at the basis of the book. So I worked that out with the people that own the house, and then we put out a press release, and I got tons of coverage. I did television interviews, newspapers, magazines, all to talk about this author giving away an overnight stay in a real haunted house. And this isn't just any haunted house. Like, it's on a tiny little island off the coast. You can only get to it at certain times of the day when the tide is high enough. So ultimately, we picked one person. They got to pick 3 of their friends. We put them in a boat. We took them out to the dock, dropped them off at the haunted house, left them for 24 hours and came back for them. But like, everybody was talking about this on social media, like, I'll do it. Will you do it? I'll do it if you do it. All of that buzz was free. Like I can buy Facebook and Amazon ads just like everybody else can. But, a lot of times if you stop, you turn those things off, the sales dry up with it. But if you can create word of mouth, that goes on forever.
Oh my God, this is absolutely amazing, and I have to use that as a case study in a book I'm collecting for authors called The Book in Hand, basically marketing print books. I'll have to reach out to your assistant to see if I can get some more details about that, so I can be accurate in how I portray it. But I
Yeah,
love that. I
absolutely.
love that thinking outside the haunted house.
Well, a lot of that comes from working with Patterson. Like him and I, like, we brainstorm book ideas, but we talk just as much about the business side. And I tried to get him to talk about this a little bit at Author Nation when I interviewed him, but it's like wrangling cats with that guy. But along came a spider when he released that. It did well, but not what he wanted it to. And he could have just let it go. Most authors I think probably would, but he paid $500 out of his own pocket and recorded a television spot when nobody was doing television spots for books. And that's what spurred sales. That's what brought that book to the bestseller list. So it's just, sometimes just thinking a little bit outside the box is all you need to do.
I love that. And I know he was under the weather. He was suffering from COVID, so obviously, and it was great that he actually got up and into a chair so he
Yeah.
could do the interview. But is he normally that way? Like you said, wrangling cats to get him to
He's
go down that path that you wanted to share that story?
I think he approaches it with certain things he wants to talk about. I knew what the audience wanted to hear. One of the other things I really wanted to get him talking about is, like he wrote Thomas Berriman Number. That was his first novel in the 70s. He was, running an ad agency in New York at the time. And along came a spider. Like he didn't write that until the 90s. He had 17 years of a dry spell, in between there. And like he
Wow.
joked about it a little bit. But if you think about that, put yourself in his shoes. If you had 17 years of writing books and rejection after rejection after rejection, how many people would continue to keep going? But he kept going, and like he's James Patterson, he sold 500 million books today. But back then, like if he hadn't kept going, and decided, well, I'll just stick with the advertising thing instead, he wouldn't be here today. So like that tenacity is huge. He once told me that hope is not a strategy, and like those words to me have been just burned into my head.
Oh, wow. And that's a great way as we wrap up this interview. JD, thank you so much for hanging out with me. This was absolutely amazing, as every conversation I've had with you is. Can you please let my listeners know where they can find you online?
Sure, I'm at jdbarker.com. All the social media is at jdbarker, and the books are pretty much in every bookstore.
Awesome, JD. Thanks again for hanging out with me.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. This was fun.